night had no reason to feel different, and yet it did. The air carried an unnatural weight, the kind that makes the silence too sharp, the kind that presses against the chest and whispers that something unseen is already watching. In the distance, a lone streetlight flickered, its light stuttering across the quiet road before surrendering to the dark. Inside a modest single-story home, the hum of an old refrigerator was the only sound that dared to exist. The house stood surrounded by trees whose branches swayed without wind, their shadows crawling slowly across the windows like hesitant fingers searching for entry. A woman sat alone in the dim kitchen, her eyes fixed on the clock above the sink. It was late, too late for the noises she kept hearing. The house had begun to sound alive, its creaks too deliberate, its sighs too human. She told herself it was just age, the way homes settle, the way imagination twists normal sounds into danger when one is alone. But then came the soft knock. Not at the door. Somewhere deeper inside, she froze. Her phone rested on the table, its black screen reflecting her pale face. She reached for it slowly, as if sudden movement might draw attention. The knock came again, faint from the end of the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound was not loud, but it carried purpose, a rhythm that suggested someone or something wanted her to listen. Her thumb hovered over the emergency number, yet she hesitated. She had done this before, called before, and the police had found nothing. They told her it was probably animals or wind or stress. But the wind did not knock. The hallway beyond the kitchen was a narrow tunnel of shadow. She could see only a sliver of light bleeding from the living room lamp. Each step she took made the floor groan beneath her. Somewhere above, a faint creak answered back like a reply. The phone trembled in her hand. She whispered, barely audible, "Is anyone there?" Silence answered. But then from the back door came the slow, deliberate turn of a handle. Every sense screamed for her to run, yet she could not. Her body locked in place, her heart hammering so violently that it drowned every other sound. The handle turned again, softly, carefully, as though the person on the other side was testing the lock, not forcing it. Her breath came in shallow bursts. The light from the living room flickered once, the bulb humming. She felt the presence before she saw it. A shadow moved across the curtain. Tall, still, patient. Her phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a muted thud. The shadow stopped. Then it began to move, drifting toward the window beside the back door. She backed away. One slow step at a time, her trembling hands searching for anything that could become a weapon. A knife, a lamp, anything. But before she could reach the counter, the sound came again. Not from the door now, but from within the house. The soft scrape of a shoe against tile. She ran to the living room and flicked the switch, flooding the space with harsh yellow light. Empty. The furniture stood as always, the curtains still drawn, the air motionless. But something felt wrong. The faint smell of soil lingered in the air, damp and unfamiliar, as though someone had come in from outside. She turned toward the hallway again. The bedroom door at the end was slightly open. She had closed it earlier. She was sure she had. Her hand shook as she picked up the fallen phone and dialed. The screen lit her face pale and glistening with fear. Each ring on the line felt longer than the last. When the voice on the other end finally answered, she spoke in a trembling whisper. "There is someone in my house." The operator asked her to stay calm, to describe what she could see. But she could not find words. The house seemed to pulse with sound now, soft movement, faint breathing, the distant creak of floorboards shifting under deliberate weight. The operator told her help was on the way. To stay where she was, to lock herself in a room, to stay quiet, but she could not move. Her eyes were fixed on the shadow stretching across the wall. It grew longer, wider until it reached her feet. A low sound followed, a door closing somewhere deep within the house. She stumbled backward, her body trembling as she reached the staircase to the basement. The instinct to hide took control. She descended quietly, one step at a time, the air growing colder as she went. Her phone connection dropped the moment she reached the bottom. No signal, only darkness. She crouched behind the washer, pulling a blanket from a nearby shelf to cover herself, barely daring to breathe. Minutes crawled by. Every small noise became monstrous in the silence. The drip of a pipe, the groan of the floor above, the faint shuffle of movement. Then came the whisper of footsteps descending the stairs. Slow, measured. No words, no sound but breath and the faint scuff of shoes. She pressed her hand over her mouth, tears burning her eyes. The footsteps stopped halfway down. A long pause. Then a whisper, not from the phone, not from her imagination, but from the dark itself. It said her name. She nearly screamed but swallowed the sound, trembling violently as she clutched the fabric tighter. The voice came again, closer, gentler, almost mocking. It repeated her name once more before silence returned. Then came the click of the basement light switch. Nothing happened. The bulb had burned out days ago. She could only hear the faint hum of the house breathing around her. A distant siren rose outside, faint but growing. The footsteps turned back up the stairs. She waited until she could no longer hear them, until the house was still once more. She did not move. Not when the flashing lights painted the basement windows red and blue. Not when the muffled voices of officers called her name. When they found her, she was still behind the washer, eyes wide open, unable to speak. The back door was unlocked. The lock was not broken. Nothing was taken. But near the kitchen table on the cold linoleum floor lay a single muddy footprint, facing inward. That night, the officers told her she was safe now. But she knew better. Safety, she realized, is just a word people use until the next sound in the dark proves them wrong. Every lock in the world means nothing when the one inside no longer feels safe. The house stood at the far end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by oaks that had watched generations come and go. It was not new, nor old enough to be considered historic, just an ordinary home that had somehow outlasted the noise of the world around it. The town itself was small, the kind of place where people still waved to passing cars and trusted one another enough to leave their doors unlocked. It was the kind of town that believed evil lived somewhere else, far away in headlines and television screens, never in their own streets. That illusion of safety was what made what happened there so unforgettable. In the daylight, the house looked harmless. White paint, a front porch lined with wind chimes, a faded mailbox with peeling numbers. During the day, children rode bicycles past it, laughing as the wind caught their hair. But when the sun went down, something about it changed. Its shape seemed sharper against the dark. The windows, once reflective and calm, appeared hollow, like empty eyes that had seen too much. The house had no history of tragedy before that night, but after it, no one would speak of it the same way again. The family who lived there had moved in just 6 months before. They were quiet, private people. A father who worked long hours at a factory on the edge of town, a mother who stayed home caring for their 2 children, and a young boy barely old enough to understand fear. To the neighbors, they were ordinary, perhaps too ordinary. They waved when expected, smiled politely, but rarely invited anyone in. There was no reason for suspicion, no sign of distress. They lived the same as everyone else until the nights began to change. It started subtly. The father began to mention how the motion light outside sometimes flickered on, even when no one was near. The mother joked that it must be raccoons, but then the dog began to bark at the empty yard, its fur bristling, eyes fixed on the tree line. They thought little of it at first. The woods behind the house were dense and animals often wandered close. Still, something about the dog's unease lingered. It refused to sleep near the back door. Instead, it began curling up near the children's room, as if guarding them from something unseen. Then came the footprints. The father found them one morning, pressed deep into the wet soil near the back fence. He tried to dismiss them, saying they were from delivery workers or local kids cutting through the property. But the size of the prints made him pause. They were large, deliberate, and pointed directly toward the house, not away from it. He covered them up, not mentioning them again. Later that week, he installed an extra lock on the back door. The mother began to feel uneasy when she was alone. She described the sense of being watched, especially when she did laundry near the basement stairs. Sometimes she heard what sounded like soft breathing, though she told herself it was the sound of the house venting air. Other times she would find the basement light on when she was certain she had turned it off. It was the sort of unease that grows slowly, like a shadow at dusk, barely noticed at first until it is all that remains. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, they heard a thud upstairs. The children froze, forks in midair. The father rose from his chair, irritation masking the tremor in his voice. He went to check, returning a few minutes later with a confused look. Nothing was out of place. Still, the sound had been real enough that no one finished eating. That night, the father placed a hammer under the bed just in case. Neighbors began noticing strange details too. A curtain that moved when no one was home. A faint light glowing through the windows long after midnight. One man who walked his dog every night said he once saw a figure standing near the fence. A silhouette taller than any man he knew, motionless, as if watching the house. When he blinked, it was gone. He told himself it was a trick of light, but he changed his route after that. As weeks passed, the mother's personality shifted. She stopped answering the phone. She kept the blinds closed even during the day. When neighbors waved, she offered only tight smiles. Her once cheerful voice turned quiet and uncertain. When her sister called to ask how she was settling in, the mother replied softly, "It feels like the house is listening." Her sister laughed, thinking it was a joke. But the tone in her voice was not playful. Then there was the storm. It arrived one Friday night unannounced and violent. Thunder shook the walls, rain slashed against the windows, and the power went out. The family huddled in the living room with candles. The children slept fitfully while the parents whispered in the dark. At some point in the night there came a noise that neither thunder nor rain could explain, a sound like wood being pried apart. The father grabbed his flashlight and went toward the kitchen, but the beam flickered out before he reached the door. When he returned, he was pale. He claimed he had seen nothing, but he did not sleep again until morning. After that night, the family began locking every window, every door, even in the daytime. The father took time off work. The mother stopped stepping outside after dusk. They were both exhausted, running on fear that had no proof, no face, only presence. They tried to move past it, to convince themselves that stress had taken its toll. But when the new week began, the father found something waiting at the back door. A single damp glove placed neatly on the doormat. No one could explain how it got there. It was not theirs. It was not from any of the neighbors. The glove was large, old, worn, and covered in fine black soil, the same kind found behind their fence. The police took it, shrugged, and promised to patrol the area more often. That was all. Life continued, at least on the surface, but something inside that house had already changed. They began to sleep with the lights on, afraid of the dark they once found comforting. The house no longer felt like home. It felt occupied, watched, claimed. And every night just before sleep, the mother swore she could hear faint sounds through the walls, the drag of a boot, the breath of someone waiting, the slow rhythm of a heart that was not her own. She told her husband that something had entered their lives long before it entered their home. He did not answer. He only looked toward the window where the curtain swayed despite the air being still. The town still spoke of that house even years later because everyone remembered what came next. It was not the sound that frightened them most, nor the sight. It was the quiet before, the quiet that felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to begin. The days that followed carried an unshakable strangeness, as though the air itself had learned to whisper. The family tried to return to normal, forcing laughter at breakfast, pretending the mornings were safe. Yet something unseen had already shifted. The walls no longer held warmth. They absorbed every sound and gave nothing back. Even the sunlight that poured through the windows felt cold, pale, hesitant, as if afraid to touch the floorboards where footsteps had once been heard. The father busied himself with repairs, though nothing truly needed fixing. He nailed the windows shut, replaced locks, and trimmed the branches that brushed too close to the house. He worked with a quiet desperation, as if action alone could drive away whatever watched them. But fear had no form, no edge to strike. It hid in the stillness between breaths. When night came, his tools offered no comfort. He lay awake, eyes open, counting every creak that rose from the foundation, every sigh that moved through the vents. The mother grew pale. Her hands trembled when she washed dishes, her eyes often fixed on the backyard. She told her husband she sometimes saw movement there, like someone crouching near the fence before vanishing. He looked every time, finding nothing but darkness. Yet he stopped telling her she was imagining things. They had both begun to hear the same sounds. The faint scrape of something metallic against glass, the soft thud of a door nudged open and closed again. The kind of noises that were too deliberate to belong to the house itself. One night, as the clock neared midnight, the family's dog began to growl. It was not the sharp bark of warning, but a low, guttural sound of primal fear. The boy woke first, calling for his mother. She ran to his room, finding the dog planted firmly in front of the window, teeth bared, eyes locked on the shadows outside. The porch light flickered on by itself, spilling weak light over the yard. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw someone, tall, unmoving, just beyond the edge of the light. Then the bulb went dark again and the figure was gone. They called the police once more. Officers walked the perimeter, shone their flashlights over the wet grass, and left after finding nothing. One officer suggested perhaps it was a prank. Another mentioned wildlife. They promised extra patrols, but the promise sounded hollow, routine. When their car lights faded down the road, the mother stood at the window and whispered, "He will come back." Her husband asked how she knew. She said, "Because he never left." After that night, they began hearing whispers, faint ones, indistinct like a radio signal buried under static. The sounds came mostly from the vents and sometimes from the basement. The father checked every pipe, every duct, found nothing. The whispers would stop whenever he entered a room, then start again once he left. They seemed to follow the mother especially, echoing faintly through the house like someone speaking from the other side of a wall. The children started sleeping in their parents' room, their small beds pushed together on the floor. The mother told them it was temporary, just until everything felt normal again. But normal never returned. Then came the smell, a faint earthy scent like wet soil and rust. It drifted through the hallway each night around the same time. The father searched the basement for mold, for leaks, for anything that could explain it. He found the dirt floor disturbed near the far corner, as though someone had been digging. He filled the small patch with new soil, tamped it down, and told no one. But the smell grew stronger the next night. The town had begun to talk. The neighbors whispered that something was wrong with that family, that maybe they were falling apart. Some said the husband had become paranoid, others that the wife was ill. One neighbor, a retired man who liked to sit on his porch late at night, swore he saw light coming from the basement window at 3 a.m, long after the house had gone dark. When he blinked, the light was gone, replaced by the still glow of the moon on glass. A few days later, the mother found the back door unlocked again. She was certain she had locked it the night before. There were no signs of forced entry, no missing items, no evidence of intrusion, only the subtle rearrangement of things too small to notice at first. A chair moved slightly away from the table, a photograph tilted at an unfamiliar angle, the sugar jar left open. To anyone else it would have seemed trivial, but to her each detail felt like a quiet message. I was here. Her sleep grew restless. Each time she closed her eyes, she dreamed of walking through the house only to see herself standing in the corner, staring back. The children began having nightmares, describing a man with no face who stood by the door each night, waiting. The father dismissed it as imagination until he heard the soft tap of knuckles against the bedroom wall just before dawn. The police were called again, and again they found nothing. The officers' expressions shifted from concern to quiet doubt. They stopped patrolling as often. The family was left to face whatever haunted their home alone. Then came the night the power went out. The silence was total, the kind that pressed against the ears until one could hear the rush of their own blood. The air felt thick, heavy with moisture and dread. The father lit a candle and went to check the breaker box in the basement. He descended slowly, the flame trembling. As he reached the bottom step, he noticed something strange. The air was colder than before, and the smell of soil was strong enough to make his throat tighten. He shone the candle toward the far wall. The corner he had filled days ago was disturbed again. The soil was freshly turned, damp, uneven. For a long moment he could not move. Then behind him something shifted, a faint shuffle, a soft exhale. He turned, the candle shaking. The flame flickered wildly, throwing long, broken shadows across the walls. Nothing was there. Yet the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. He backed away, heart pounding, until he reached the stairs. When he came upstairs, he told his wife they needed to leave. Not tomorrow. Now. But as they gathered their things, the lights flickered back to life. Relief washed over them for only a second before they heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps above them, slow and deliberate, pacing across the attic. The father climbed the narrow ladder, flashlight in hand. The door creaked open, revealing insulation, old boxes, and darkness. The air was thick with dust. He moved the light slowly from one side to the other. Then it caught something near the corner, A footprint in the dust, fresh and deep, facing the hatch where he stood. He came down wordlessly. His wife asked what he had seen. He did not answer. He simply locked the attic and said, "We are not alone here." From that night forward, they never spoke loudly again inside the house. Their voices became whispers. Every sound felt like an invitation. Every silence felt like a response. The neighbors noticed the change. The drawn curtains, the lights left burning through the night, the way no laughter escaped from that house anymore. No one knew yet what was truly happening inside, but everyone could feel it. The air around that home had thickened like a storm waiting to break. And soon, it would. By the time investigators arrived, the house had already begun to feel less like a home and more like an echo of one. The family was gone, moved to a relative's residence on the other side of town, their possessions left scattered as though they had fled rather than relocated. What remained was an unease that no amount of sunlight could dispel. Officers entered quietly, their boots sinking slightly into the warped wooden floor, the air thick with a scent that reminded them of rain-soaked earth and something metallic beneath. Nothing in particular stood out at first, but nothing felt right either. The house seemed to breathe faintly, its silence broken only by the groan of shifting beams. They began their assessment room by room, taking photographs, jotting notes. In the living room, dust outlined where furniture had been moved recently. On one wall, faint scratch marks appeared near the baseboard. Thin, parallel, not deep enough to be from an animal, yet too deliberate to be accidental. One officer suggested the family's dog might have done it, but the angle of the grooves was strange, almost as if made from inside the wall. They moved on. The kitchen floor bore faint scuffs near the back door, circular as though someone had stood there for long periods, turning slightly in place. The latch was intact, no forced entry, but the metal itself was cold. Unnaturally cold even after the sun had been streaming in for hours. The pantry door was left ajar, and though there was nothing inside except old jars and half-used spices, one of the shelves bore a thin coat of dust disturbed only in the center, forming the faint imprint of fingers. Whoever had been there had not been searching. They had been waiting. When investigators reached the basement, they paused. The smell of damp soil hit them the moment the door opened. A single light bulb hung from a cord, its faint yellow glow barely touching the far walls. The cement foundation met earth where the basement had never been fully finished. Near the far end of the room, where the father had once filled the soil, they found it disturbed again. Fresh. The patch of ground was uneven, and the surface still held the faint impressions of a boot's tread. The officers knelt to inspect it, noting how the earth crumbled loosely under their gloves. Beneath, something glinted. A fragment of metal, small, curved, worn. It was the head of a key. The discovery was noted but not prioritized. Older homes often hid remnants from their past. Yet the basement held more. The back wall, behind a row of cardboard boxes, revealed a crawlspace entry, barely large enough for a person to fit through. The door was crude, made from thin wood and nails. When opened, it exhaled stale air that smelled of mildew and something older. Inside, they found an empty blanket, half buried in dust, and the faint outline where someone might have rested. The police report would later describe it as evidence of possible transient activity. But the air in that narrow passage felt wrong, heavy, electric, as if carrying the memory of breath. Upstairs, the bedrooms told quieter stories. The children's room still had toys arranged neatly on shelves, though one of the dolls lay face down in the corner. A police photographer lifted it gently, revealing a small piece of fabric tucked beneath. It was a torn section of a man's shirt cuff, dark, stiff, smelling faintly of smoke. The father's closet held shirts of different fabric entirely. No one could explain where it came from. Neighbors were interviewed in the following days. One recalled seeing a man weeks earlier walking along the tree line near the property, tall and thin, carrying something metallic that caught the sunlight. Another swore that on certain nights before the incident, she heard a rhythmic tapping sound coming from the direction of that house, like metal striking wood in slow intervals. No one could say for sure when it stopped. Police traced every report, but no matching suspect emerged. No trespassers had been detained. No fingerprints matched any known records. The glove that had been found earlier, muddy, large, left on the doorstep, yielded no prints either, only traces of earth rich with minerals uncommon to the local area. When compared with the soil from the disturbed basement patch, the composition was identical. Psychologists were consulted at the family's request, hoping to understand if collective stress had caused their paranoia. One expert noted the phenomenon of environmental suggestion, where subtle cues, a creaking house, shifting temperature, repeating noises, can manifest as perceived stalking or intrusion. But the expert's tone faltered when shown the photographs of the disturbed soil, the glove, and the crawlspace blanket. He admitted that fear may distort reality, but sometimes reality is distorted enough on its own. In later interviews, the mother described hearing someone whisper her name through the vents, sometimes during daylight, sometimes as she drifted to sleep. The father corroborated hearing faint knocks, always 3, always from the same wall separating the living room from the kitchen. He had once measured the time between knocks, 12 seconds apart, consistent, precise, deliberate. The police could not replicate the sound when testing the walls. One night's security footage from a neighboring home showed something strange. The camera, facing the street, captured the family's house faintly in the background. At 2:13 a.m., a flicker of light appeared near the attic window, like the brief flash of a lighter. The light moved once, side to side, then vanished. No one in the family smoked. The following morning, investigators entered the attic. Dust blanketed everything, except for one narrow path leading from the entrance to the far corner. There, half buried under insulation, they found a cracked mirror. Its surface was smeared with fingerprints, too many to count, overlapping one another like a desperate pattern. It was unclear if the mirror had been broken recently or if it had always been there. When one officer lifted it, a faint imprint in the dust suggested that something, perhaps someone, had been lying behind it. Facing the entrance, they catalogued each finding, each clue that meant something yet explained nothing. But beneath every observation lay the same quiet horror, the realization that whoever had entered the home knew it intimately. The movements through rooms, the avoidance of detection, the awareness of timing, all spoke of familiarity. It was not random. It was studied. Days later, the family's case file was marked unresolved disturbance. The phrase became an echo of bureaucracy, cold, neat, void of meaning. The police moved on, but the story did not end there. The house remained empty, yet neighbors still reported lights flickering at odd hours, shadows moving past windows. No one wanted to buy it. Eventually, the property was sealed, left to rot quietly under the trees. Years later, when the town expanded and developers began demolishing the old homes, one of the workers broke through the basement wall during excavation. Behind the concrete, they found a narrow cavity filled with old wood and soil, and in that soil the remnants of another door, leading deeper underground. The report ended there. No follow-up, no photographs, no explanation. The developer halted the project, claiming structural instability. The house was demolished, the ground leveled, and yet those who worked there said the air beneath the earth carried the same scent of wet soil and rusted metal. Even now, some nights when the wind moves through that street, people say they hear faint tapping beneath the ground, slow, rhythmic, deliberate, and no one ever found out who had been inside that house or how long they had been there before the family finally noticed. When the family finally left that house, they did not speak on the drive away. No one said goodbye to the street, no one looked back. The father's knuckles gripped the steering wheel until his fingers turned white, and the mother stared out the window with eyes that no longer blinked often enough. The children were quiet in the back seat, too young to understand the shape of their fear, but old enough to feel its weight. They did not cry. They had already cried too much. Silence became their language, a language the house had taught them well. In the first few nights after leaving, sleep did not come easily. The mother would lie awake in the small guest room of her sister's home, listening to every creak of the walls, every distant car that passed by, convinced that the sound was following her. The father had begun locking every door and window at sundown, checking each one twice before bed, then rising again to check them a third time when the silence became unbearable. The children sometimes woke screaming, though they could never explain what they dreamed of, only that it was dark, and someone was standing in the doorway watching them. Breathe. The therapist who met with the family described them as displaced within themselves. They were physically safe, but Mentally still trapped inside the house, they had fled. Each of them showed signs of hypervigilance, startling at small sounds, freezing at the creak of wood beneath their feet. The mother flinched when someone knocked on the door. The father refused to leave lights off even during the day. He began to speak less, retreating into the quiet of his own mind where explanations could not reach him. When asked to describe what they experienced, neither parent could tell the story the same way twice. Their memories had become fragmented, time blending, details shifting, emotions bleeding into each other. Some days the father insisted the noises were real intrusions. Other days he believed they might have lost their minds together. The mother, however, never doubted what she felt. "Something entered our home," she said in a voice that trembled but did not waver. It was not a person. It was not an idea. It was something that wanted us to see it and then doubt that we had. Her words disturbed the therapist, who noted how her fear carried conviction, not delusion. She spoke of the sensation of being watched long before the noises began, an awareness that grew sharper, more intimate, as if the presence knew her patterns better than she did. She said it waited for moments when she was alone, moments of quiet when her thoughts were soft enough to be heard. "It learned me," she whispered once. "It learned how to move like my house so I would stop noticing it." The children adapted differently. The older one became silent, retreating into drawing. Their pages filled with black crayon, long hallways, and figures standing in corners. The younger one began asking questions no parent could answer. "How do we know when someone stops being in our house?" Or, "Can something follow us without walking?" The parents tried to reassure them, but reassurance was empty when both knew the same question had crossed their minds in the dark. Weeks passed. They tried to rebuild life in small ways. The father found temporary work. The mother volunteered at a local library, surrounding herself with noise and light. The children began school again, though the teachers noted their quietness, the way they avoided loud sounds and glanced often at doors. On the surface, life continued. Yet underneath, the shadow of that house stretched far. The mother began hearing the same faint tapping at night. At first she thought it was her imagination, the memory of old noises haunting new walls. But one evening, as she read to her children, a soft knock came from beneath the floor. 3 taps. 12 seconds apart. She froze. Her son looked up and said, "It found us." After that, the father began staying up late, sitting in the living room with the lights on, staring at the door. He told himself it was to protect his family, but deep down he feared that he was waiting for the sound, for the shadow, for proof that what they had endured was not madness. Each night the quiet pressed closer. The hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the walls, the faint whistle of wind, all harmless until one becomes too aware of them. Then they stop sounding like background noise and begin to resemble breathing. The mother's health declined. She grew thinner, sleep-deprived, her eyes hollow from nights spent waiting for dawn. She told her sister that sometimes she caught glimpses of the old house when she closed her eyes, the hallway stretching, the door opening, the smell of soil rising. She said she dreamed of standing in the basement again, only this time there was no floor beneath her, only an endless pit of dark earth that whispered her name. She began sleeping with a small lamp on, afraid of what the dark might remember. The children's drawings changed. They no longer drew the figure in the corner. Instead, they drew the house itself, but differently each time, as though it were shifting shape. One drawing showed windows for eyes, another showed roots instead of a foundation. When asked why, the older child said, "It is growing." By then, the father had started drinking quietly at night, not out of pleasure, but out of the need to quiet the thoughts that came when the world went still. He once confessed to the therapist that he sometimes missed the house, not the fear, but the clarity it gave. "When we lived there," he said, "everything made sense. We knew what to be afraid of. Out here, it feels like the fear is inside us now, like we carried it out with us." His words stayed with the therapist long after the sessions ended. Because it was true. Trauma has a way of following the shape of its victims, fitting itself into the spaces they leave unguarded. The family's fear had adapted, survived, and grown quieter, just like the thing they once believed haunted their home. Months later, when the mother returned to the old neighborhood to collect forgotten paperwork, she parked across the street from the demolished lot. The house was gone, replaced by flattened soil and a construction sign. But standing there in her car, she swore she could still see its outline in the dirt. The faint impression of walls, the shadow where a door used to be. She rolled down the window, letting the air in. It smelled of wet earth and something faintly metallic. Her hands began to tremble. She turned the ignition, ready to drive away. But before the car moved, she heard it again, soft and deliberate, rising from somewhere below the ground. 3 taps, 12 seconds apart. She left without looking back. That night, as she lay in bed beside her husband, she whispered, "I think it never left. It just waits for another home to open its door." And neither of them slept. The official investigation never reached a conclusion, but it spawned an endless network of whispers, rumors, and interpretations that spread far beyond the quiet town where the story began. What remained in the public record was sparse. A handful of police reports, several unconfirmed witness statements, and one sealed forensic analysis that no one outside the department ever read. But unofficially, off the record, officers and locals alike continued to debate what had really happened inside that house, long after it had been torn down. The first theory was the most ordinary, and therefore the most comfortable: an intruder. According to this explanation, someone had broken in, studied the family, and chosen not to harm them but to observe them instead. Perhaps a stalker, perhaps a vagrant using the crawl space as shelter. The disturbed soil, the glove, the fingerprints on the attic mirror, each detail seemed to point toward a physical presence. The police favored this conclusion quietly, because it was solvable in theory. It offered a human reason to something deeply inhuman, yet the simplicity of it could not explain everything. If a person had lived in the walls or beneath the floorboards, they had done so with an impossible awareness of the family's lives. The timing of the footsteps, the precise intervals of the knocks, the whispering through the vents, all implied planning, patience, and a kind of psychological cruelty that defied randomness. No signs of theft, vandalism, or violence existed. Whoever or whatever had entered that home was not there to take or destroy. They were there to remain unseen, to inhabit the silence between moments. And that was something human intention rarely sustains for long. The second theory came from within the community itself, whispered by those who had lived there long enough to remember the land before the houses. Long before the neighborhood had been built, the ground had been used for excavation. Some said there had been a well at the center of that property, sealed decades ago after a man fell into it and was never recovered. Old maps of the area hinted at mining tunnels that ran beneath the slope, carved in the late 1800s. These were filled in later, or claimed to have been. The disturbed soil in the basement, some argued, was not a coincidence. The scent of wet earth, the faint metallic tang that lingered in the air, it all felt older than the family's fear, as though they had awakened something that had never truly left. This theory gained quiet support after the demolition. Workers had reported voices echoing from beneath the ground, not clear words but tones, like the residue of sound rather than sound itself. No one admitted this officially, but 3 separate contractors refused to return to the site after sunset. One claimed that when they broke through the foundation, the air that escaped was warm, as though something living had been sealed inside. The third theory came from the psychological realm, and it was the most unsettling because it touched on the fragility of perception. A forensic psychologist who reviewed the family's case suggested the events might represent a form of collective delusion, triggered by environmental stressors, possibly low-frequency vibrations, toxic mold, or even carbon monoxide leaks. Exposure to these elements, he wrote, can produce hallucinations, paranoia, and a distorted sense of presence. The evidence was circumstantial, but persuasive enough to explain how multiple people could experience fear without an external threat. However, when the soil samples from the house were tested, no chemical irregularities were found. Carbon levels were normal. Mold spores were minimal. The air quality was clear. The physical explanations began to erode under the weight of missing proof, and the psychologist's report quietly disappeared into the archive. Still, he kept one note for himself. There is an intelligence to this fear. It learns from its observers. The fourth and least rational theory emerged from the town's folklore circles. They believed what haunted the family was not a person or a delusion, but a residue, an echo of emotion embedded in a place. They spoke of the dwellers, unseen remnants of grief or violence that linger beneath old structures. Not ghosts, but impressions that behave like memory. Imperfect, recurring, hungry for acknowledgement. The sound of footsteps, the whispering vents, the tapping pattern. These were not attempts to scare, but efforts to be noticed. To remind the living that they were not the first to occupy the space. Paranormal investigators visited the lot years later, after hearing the rumors. They brought equipment, recorders, infrared cameras, electromagnetic sensors, and spent 2 nights in tents near the foundation's remains. The recordings captured faint noises, shuffling, low knocks, and what sounded like a deep exhale close to the microphone. One of the team members later described the sensation of something passing just behind him, though no one else had been near. Another said she dreamed of being underground, surrounded by whispering that came from every direction. When she woke, her tent zipper was open, though it had been secured from the inside. The team's footage was inconclusive, and they left before the 3rd night. None of them ever released the raw tapes. There was, of course, another theory, one that surfaced only once, mentioned by a former officer who worked the original case. He spoke to a journalist years later under anonymity, describing something that had unsettled him during the first walkthrough. He claimed that when he entered the house's basement, he heard the sound of breathing. At first he thought it was his partner, but when he turned, the other officer was still upstairs. The breathing stopped the instant he noticed it. He later returned alone to check for air leaks or drafts, but none were found. When asked if he believed the house was haunted, he only replied, "Haunted by what, I do not know. But I believe something was waiting for them before they moved in." The journalist never published his words, but a copy of the interview transcript survived in local archives. The final line of his testimony read, "It was not what entered their home that frightened me. It was the sense that their home had been waiting to be entered." Over time, the story grew less about the family and more about what their fear had revealed. People wondered if the human mind could create presence from absence, or if certain places could awaken parts of the mind that are meant to remain dormant. What disturbed everyone most was that no one, not the police, not the scientists, not the spiritualists, could fully claim ownership of the truth. Each theory touched a corner of it, but none fit perfectly. Perhaps the explanation lies somewhere between reason and nightmare, where human awareness brushes against something older and unrecognizable. Perhaps the family's fear did not create the presence, but invited it, shaped it, gave it form. In that sense, the thing in the house was not a stranger at all. It was something familiar, something born the moment they first felt unsafe and began to listen for what might answer. And whatever that was, it had learned their names. The lot where the house once stood looks empty now. Though emptiness is a lie, the land tells itself. Grass has grown over the flattened soil, uneven and thin the way hair grows across an old scar. New families drive past it without slowing down, never noticing how birds avoid landing there, how the air turns slightly cooler at that bend in the road. There is nothing left to see, no foundation, no fence, not even the porch steps that once creaked under tired feet. Yet those who knew the story never linger. They say the space hums faintly, a sound too low to be heard but heavy enough to be felt, as if the earth remembers the rhythm of something that once lived inside it. The official record calls it a closed case. No evidence of criminal activity, no sign of trespassers, no remains, no explanation. The kind of summary that turns terror into a paragraph. The family has moved 3 times since then, farther each time, like a ripple trying to escape the center of its own reflection. They stopped using their real names, stopped answering questions, stopped telling the story. And yet the story tells itself. It finds listeners. It survives through the kind of silence that makes people turn their heads when lights flicker for no reason. Neighbors who still live nearby say that every few years, new construction begins on the lot but never finishes. One developer abandoned equipment overnight, claiming he heard something moving underground. Another built half a foundation before tearing it back out after workers complained of nausea, migraines, and the sound of distant breathing through the pipes. The town council blamed bad wiring and soil instability, but there are no wires there now and the soil was replaced twice. It did not change anything. At night, the lot feels wider than it looks, as though it stretches farther than it should. Drivers who pass by after midnight say they sometimes see light in the field, a dim, pulsing glow that moves slowly, like the beam of a flashlight searching for something. One man swore that when he stopped to look, the light turned toward him and went out. He left without speaking, his face pale and wet with sweat. The next day, his car would not start. Mechanics found nothing wrong. Theories still drift through the community like pollen. Some say it was never a haunting but an echo of something more ordinary. Paranoia that grew until it took shape. Fear manifesting as reality. Others whisper that the thing never lived in the house, but in the people who entered it. That the walls and the soil were mirrors, not hosts, reflecting something hidden in every person who stayed long enough to listen. They say the tapping, the whispers, the soft voice that called from the dark. All of it was the sound of their own minds knocking back. But if that is true, then the question remains, whose voice did they hear first? When the town library digitized its archives, a file appeared that had never been cataloged before, a scan of an old surveyor's map from 1923. On that map, the land that would become the family's neighborhood was labeled Section 9, Holding Ground. No one could explain what the term meant. The document listed no ownership, no previous structure, no reference to its purpose. Just those words typed faintly in the corner, holding ground. Someone tried to trace the phrase through county records but found only a single note in a later file that read, "Section condemned due to subsoil contamination, not suitable for residential use." The record was dated 50 years before the first house was built there. The phrase became its own local myth. People speculated what it meant. Some said the ground held water, others said it held memory. A retired geologist once said the soil in that area was unusually dense, rich in iron and clay, capable of preserving impressions longer than most. He was speaking of physical impressions, roots, fossils, ancient imprints, but the word preserving took on a life of its own. If the earth could hold the weight of what once rested on it, could it also hold something unseen? Could it remember the rhythm of footsteps, the pattern of breathing, the tone of fear itself? One night, months after the final demolition, a passerby recorded a video from his car as he drove through the empty road where the house once stood. The footage shows only darkness and the faint outlines of trees. For a moment his headlights catch something white, a figure standing at the edge of the lot, motionless, facing the road. The shape is human, but too tall, too thin, its head tilted slightly to the side as though listening. The driver's voice is audible, shaky and quiet. There's someone there. When the car turns, the figure is gone. The video ends with the sound of the engine accelerating. Experts who reviewed the footage called it inconclusive. Some said it was a trick of light. Others noticed something stranger. The reflection of two small lights in the lower half of the frame like eyes, but positioned too close together to belong to the figure. The clip circulated online briefly before being deleted. No one knows by whom. The family never saw the video. They live quietly now, far from the town. The children are grown, their memories fractured but persistent. In interviews, they rarely speak of what happened, but when pressed, the son once said, "It was not the house that frightened me. It was how quickly fear learned our names." His mother, older now, spends her days tending a small garden behind their latest home. She says she no longer dreams of the old house, but sometimes when she waters the plants, she swears she can smell soil that does not belong there. One evening, she found her gardening gloves missing. She searched the shed, the porch, the fence. They reappeared the next morning, resting neatly on the doorstep, damp with dew, though the ground was dry. Her husband dismissed it as forgetfulness, but her hands trembled when she picked them up. There was a faint trace of rust on the fingers. The old officer who once worked the case retired long ago, yet sometimes he drives past the empty lot on his way home. He does not stop, but he slows down just enough to look. He says the land feels alive, unsettled, like the surface of water right before it begins to boil. When asked if he believes in hauntings, he shakes his head. "No," he says quietly. "I believe in echoes, and echoes only exist when something answers back." Every so often, on windless nights, the people who live near that stretch of road still hear faint sounds under the soil. They say it starts as a vibration, then grows into a slow pattern of knocks, 3 at a time, 12 seconds apart. Some claim to hear a voice whisper between the taps, calling softly from below. No one ever digs to find the source. And maybe that is the truest horror of all, that sometimes, when the unknown finally stops knocking, it is not because it left. It is because it found its way inside. The door may be locked, but what enters is never only human.